Hello and welcome to Unparliamentary Language, a podcast that abides by new COVID regulations, as me, Rob, and our 4 other listeners can all still meet up. And how are you, Rob?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
Yeah, I mean, all right. I think we're going to kind of head on straight into our headlines, which, we've already alluded to in the joke. Yeah, I kind of feel like things were a bit built up in the media. I know most of the information we got just now was kind of leaked. In fact, if anything, I don't think Boris's announcement was of any use. Like, he didn't even actually outline any of... Like, he didn't say step by step, here's what's happening. He just kind of waffled on. And I think I must have missed some of the previous ones, because I thought they were a bit better handled than that. But maybe you can give more insight on that, because I've obviously missed a few, and it was just him sat in a room talking about stuff. But I suppose we want to go into the headlines so that we can talk about this. So from the Metro, we had "This May Hurt a Bit," which was talking about the fact that it could be 6 months of restrictions now that we're coming out of summer. And yeah, we've had the introduction of the Rule of 6, which was going on last week. So do you want to tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, so a lot has changed since we last spoke about how the government is approaching coronavirus. I think within the past 2 weeks, we've seen a real spike in cases, haven't we? And that's prompted Chris Whitty and Valance to come out in a press conference on Monday to sort of outline that, by the way, things are getting worse, and if things continue at this rate, I think they said within 2 weeks' time, we could be looking at 50,000 infections a day, which is quite a significant increase, and it's quite a shock to the system when you think we went into lockdown, when was it, March? We were in lockdown for a month or two, and then we came out of that, and then the summer seems to have been relatively quiet. Although it's been an odd summer and we've had to wear masks, there's been a slow kind of trying to reopen things, trying to reopen the economy, and the message from the government in particular was go out, have fun, but try and be responsible while you're doing it. So you've had the Eat Out to Help Out scheme, you've had some trials of fans going back to games. Those are the 2 things that kind of like, a push to get people back into the office and go back to work, particularly after the message, was after that first lockdown, stay at home, stay indoors, protect the NHS. We were very much encouraged to work from home if we could. And the government seemed to be moving away from that. Now in the past 2 weeks, it seems to have, the government's had to roll back some of that messaging. And I think that's caused a bit of confusion amongst the general public. And I think that's because the public health message has to be a lot more nuanced this time round. So previously, 6 months ago, it was a very simple message, wasn't it? It was stay at home, protect the NHS, stay indoors. We all knew how to do that. You're not going to go to your job. Yeah. It was very Mitchell and Webb, bits of it. But yeah, there was this... That message was extreme, but very, very clear. Now the government's looking to say, right, cases might spike to the same levels that we had back in March, but we still want to try and keep the economy open, so the restrictions they've brought in seem a little bit odd in places. So they've got, for example, they've put a restriction on pubs and clubs and restaurants staying open. You can't stay open past 10 o'clock, which has led to many memes over the internet of like, oh, COVID doesn't infect you before 10 o'clock. It only comes out at night. And maybe Boris Johnson may be confusing the coronavirus with werewolves or something. I'm not sure. But there is kind of and you compare that to the Rule of 6 that we mentioned in the introduction, which is now you're only allowed to meet with up to 6 people at one time. That's both within your house and outdoors. But you can still go down the pub with your mates before 10 o'clock and meet up in a group larger of 6. How does that work? There's a lot of questions that seem to be contradicting each other. And I think it shows the tightrope that the government has to try and walk between opening the economy up and keeping people safe. The government will say that going out to places such as businesses and restaurants, they have more coronavirus legislation and restrictions on them, so they're going to be cleaner. It's going to be somebody's job to clean every table, to wipe down every surface if you go there. If you pop round somebody's house, you don't know the last time they cleaned it, blah, blah, blah. It's a lot easier for the virus to spread in that sense. So I don't think we are always a bit harsh on the government, but I think we've got to take a step back and, see that most of the decisions they're making have a degree of science involved. But obviously, when you compare them to the first round of restrictions, it does seem to be a little bit piecemeal, or the things that they've picked up seem slightly odd when you can consider all the rest of the things you can still go out and do.
Yeah, it's. I think we've seen lots of discussion when we've had these local lockdowns, right? Like, it's weird that you can't meet up at home when you can go to the pub and stuff. But the idea, so it seems like outside transmission is very unlikely. So that's why we've had like less limitations on groups outside, and it's very much the indoor stuff. It is interesting that they brought in the rule of 6 for outdoor as well, but I think that's just to make it easier, really. And I understand that, and there's a fair number of exceptions because, for example, youth groups and things like that are following, as long as they follow sensible guidelines, can still have larger groups than 6. I don't think that's changed yet. It didn't change when the rule of 6 came in, so I don't think tonight's changes do anything to affect it either. And then you have, so it's really hard because people start to get into this, like, are they being, the person complained about like this thing when they were saying, it was young people, which, I don't agree with. It wasn't. I don't think it was more young people than it was any other group. I mean, it must be a really weird life going back to university right now and only being allowed out in bubbles and stuff. There was a good interview actually with some students on the latest newscast where they were talking about how, they've got like cocktail evenings and stuff instead of like going to a mosh pit. It's quite a different experience, but it still sounds like there's a lot of stuff that has been arranged that's followed the current regulations. I suppose the other thing to add was you mentioned we had the chief scientific advisors coming out and doing that thing with the graph. I think that was a clever bit of messaging there, because that graph was not like an actual projection. I think they were very clear to say this is like, but basically they were explaining how exponentials work with a graph. They were like, if this doubles every day from now, but they're not saying like it will definitely be this in that time, or that we're not going. But it really underlines that point. It, like, the average person sees that graph, they're not going to read any more into it than, oh wow, that's where infections are going to be. Which is, I think, the point they're trying to get across with that messaging. It's like, here's where we could be. Anyone could have done that extrapolation at any point from the numbers. But yeah, I think it was kind of like, it's a bit of shock to try and make people realize that if we don't do something now, we could slip back down a slippery slope to where we were previously.
Yeah, precisely. I think, going back to Boris's speech, there were some points that I picked up in which I thought were just worth mentioning. I felt he did quite a good job of dismissing some of the thoughts you might have heard, like down the pub or from people. There's two common threads. It's like, well, it only kills people over 80, and I'm fine, and I'm willing to take the risk if it only kills 99% of people, so I'm not going to bother with those rules. His counterpunch to that was sort of, no, this is a virus, and even if you're not at risk, then you do spread, then you still have the risk of spreading it to somebody or somebody else you don't know's, loved ones. You can't just hold that risk all on yourself. You know that this is a risk that is shared, so everybody has to do their responsibility. And secondly, he dismissed the idea that some people have said that, we should just shield the vulnerable and the elderly, and everybody else should go about their normal business and not have to worry about this. Boris's counterpoint to that was that if you do that, the virus will spread amongst the community, and then it will inevitably get into care homes, places where people are shielding, because it will be so, prevalent in the population that there's no way that you can protect those people. So I felt that was a good point. At least, it made me feel reassured the government is taking this seriously, and it's not just like turning to weird right-wing bots on Twitter for their virus policy, which is a good point. Maybe the slight negative about it was the fact that, you were talking earlier about blame, and, some people have blamed the young for the spread. Boris Johnson's approach was sort of saying that, the people who are mostly at fault are people not using common sense, and we have to do that. And he backed that up by saying that there would be stricter fines on people not wearing a mask. So I think it's £200 you can be fined on the spot for not wearing a mask when you should do. There have been some newspaper headlines about a £10,000 fine if you leave isolation and you're not meant to. And there was also, Boris Johnson admitted himself that although we are a freedom-loving nation, that he may have to put more police on the streets and then the army to backfill that if needed, if he needs to police these measures more. So it shows certainly that the government is taking a more hardline approach to people who flout the rules. And I think that was something that Boris Johnson wouldn't have done at the start of this pandemic. I think there was a lot of, people will have common sense and follow the rules. And now they've gone, oh no, we do need to be a bit stricter when it comes to that. I saw the phrase, not that Twitter is any way to reflect the state of the nation and what it thinks. We've had a few private conversations about bizarre things that have trended on Twitter recently. But martial law was trending at lunchtime because he said that there might be army on the streets. Now, that is certainly upsetting a small proportion of people who are, Boris might describe them as freedom-loving, but I would say that they maybe like freedom a bit too much. I don't know. You know what I mean? They're like, yeah, they're very libertarian. They're very like, I'm not going to wear a mask because anybody tells me to. It's like, come on, mate. Just, help everybody out here. Sorry.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, I mean, if you look back to previous things that weren't as bad as this pandemic, well, we've definitely had times where there was a time that, like, we've had firefighter strikes where we had the army come out and they used the old, they called like Berthas, the old army fire engines.
Green Goddesses, isn't it?
Green Goddesses, possibly. I couldn't remember. And then also, I'm pretty certain there was army deployed during foot and mouth, just again because it's just literally more boots on the ground is the term. But like sometimes, yeah, that makes sense to do. And if you've got a load of army troops who aren't out fighting a war, then I mean, you might as well use them for something like that. I get that there's some people think it's a slippery slope once you've had them on the streets, but it's like it has happened before, and it's not like he's saying they're going to be walking around enforcing. It's not like there's a curfew in the. They didn't use the word curfew. I know that Scotland used the word curfew to describe what they were doing to their restaurants and stuff, but I think it's not the same thing. It's not like saying you can't be out after 10. It's the bars and pubs and stuff have to shut at that time, which generally means most people will go home at that point. And also I think like I can understand why someone would be concerned, but it doesn't seem like what they're proposing is ridiculous.
Yeah, going back to like the blame game point, there's some people might feel quite frustrated by this message that Boris Johnson said about like common sense, because a lot of people will feel like they've been following the rules, and their main quibbles will be with the way the government has handled it. In particular, probably the two biggest things were PPE at the start of the crisis. Boris Johnson made a point to say that, PPE stocks were there and ready in this speech now. So obviously he feels that he's resolved that problem, but that will be an upcoming challenge for the next 6 months. So that will be a headline or a PMQ's question to watch out, because I bet you that there'll be questions about PPE. The other big one that I don't think we really touched upon this last time, but it's something that's dominated the news headlines for the past 2 weeks as well, is this scandal over testing.
So our next headline from the Daily Telegraph: only select few to get rationed COVID tests. So
yeah, this is the other story that's dominated the past 2 weeks. The fact that even as infections have risen, a lot of people saying that's because children have gone back to school, they pick up a cold, they come back home, they don't know if it's a cold or flu or COVID. It means the whole house has to go into isolation. The quickest way you can get out of that isolation is by getting a test at one of the NHS track and trace centres. However, there appeared to be a problem that there was either a shortage of tests or that these tests weren't being turned around fast enough to give people the results, meaning that they could go back to work. This even happened to Keir Starmer, leader of the Labour Party, who had to miss PMQs because of it. And as I've been saying for listeners for weeks, like, watch PMQs, it's really good at the moment. The deputy leader of the Labour Party, Angela Rayner, started off her PMQs by saying, "I'd like to read a letter from a constituent I've got called Keir." Keir couldn't go to work today because he was waiting for a test. And the week before that, Keir Starmer had pressed the PM on why people were having to travel so far for tests. And one of his quotes, I believe, was, "The next time somebody drives from London to Durham with COVID systems, it'll be because they're trying to get to their nearest testing centre."
Yes.
Which, it's lines like that, which means, the government has tried to come back. I think Jacob Rees-Mogg was one who said that the Labour Party should stop with their endless carping about the test system, and that we should be trying to put people's faith into the testing system, which is like, okay, fair enough, but you also, faith isn't enough. You actually do have to provide a working test system so people can get back to work. And this issue that seems to have been, they haven't been able to resolve over the past 2 weeks of people not being able to get a test quick enough, being redirected to centres that are 100 miles away in some cases, websites sort of being fouled up, people arriving at the test and trace centres in their cars in person, seeing that there's not everybody, there's nobody there to test, but that being turned away because they say, sorry, you need an appointment, you need to book through the website, but the website's up the Swanee. There's been a lot of issues surrounding that, and that is one of the big things that the country needs if it wants to get back to work or work normally. Because as we always said, if you know you haven't got COVID and you know those who haven't got around you haven't got COVID, you're a bit more free to do things. That's how they've got the Premier League started. That's how they've got sports things, by living in a bubble and regular testing. If the public are unable to do that and somebody has to make the decision between, do I go to work today and risk spreading COVID to my colleagues, or do I stay at home and risk not getting paid for the week, and that's what I need to pay my rent? Those are some of the decisions that people are making, and it's unfair that the only reason they weren't allowed to go to work safely and in the knowledge that they wouldn't spread anything harmful to their colleagues just because they couldn't get this test. It's frustrating, and that's another reason I think why you're seeing, although the government won't admit it, I think that is one of the reasons, and a huge myriad of reasons, why COVID numbers are slowly going up, because people are forced to make decisions like that because they are unsure of the regulations or what they can do, and they say, hey, I'll take a risk when they really shouldn't. So don't think that was really covered in Boris's speech tonight. Of course, he's not going to have a go at his own system in a speech and in an address to the nation like that. But I think it's worth pointing out that it's, the government can't just blame people and their lack of common sense. They have to take some responsibility as well for what's happened and, the rising number of cases in the past few weeks.
Yeah. Just a few things to raise on testing as a concept. So we've had, there's this new fast test that's come out that has comparable results to the slower test, but it can do a test. It's like a portable kit that can do a test in 90 minutes, though it can only do a single test. So it doesn't fix the mass testing problem, but it does at least fix the speed of testing so that you can have an answer in 90 minutes, which is obviously useful for, say, smaller groups who have to meet, like for things, and it could be used like for doctors and people like that who need, you don't want them going around the ward infecting people. Though it does seem like when proper PPE is used, there aren't really these problems anymore. It was definitely at the start of the pandemic we had a lot more stories about doctors getting infected. Yeah, so I mean, there definitely is some promising signs on testing, but this whole moonshot idea, like if we can get to a point where we can have mass, quick, easy testing, that would be great, and that would definitely allow things to return to a certain level of normality. Because if you can say, I've had a test today that proves I'm fine, and we know that is fairly reliable. And in fact, I've heard some people posit, and don't quote me on any numbers here, but you could accept a slightly less reliable test if you could do significantly more of them, basically. If you can test everyone and the test is 80% efficient, that's okay compared to, say, like testing not everyone and it's 100% efficient. So like there is a line where you can say, actually, we'll just test everyone all the time whenever they go out the doors, basically. And that could also be a way back to normality prior to a vaccine being approved. Because obviously people are trying to speed up a vaccine as much as possible. The main reason a vaccine can be spread up in a pandemic is that a lot more people are getting infected. So, you can give someone a vaccine, and if they go to a hotspot and don't get ill, chances are it is working, and that's the main thing they're doing in the phase 3 trials. But yeah, it's still an area where a lot of things need to be improved for it to get to where the government wants it to be. And I think there's a reason people are being, people are both being realistic and, concerned that the government is, pinning its hopes on this, basically.
Yeah. It's been an odd trend of this crisis that the government has consistently overpromised and underdelivered, particularly when it comes to testing. In my mind, like the world-beating track and trace app has never really arrived in any great shape or form, and is not talked about very much these days. Our world-beating test system is clearly under some strain, and then even Boris Johnson's moonshot plan, which was mentioned in a PMQs as a response to Keir Starmer, where he said he would, people would be tested, like you said, almost every time you go outside, and at a huge cost to the nation. That was what was proposed in that PMQs. And then I think a week later at a select committee, he was asked about that promise, and he had no memory of it. So either Boris Johnson is a goldfish or he's just like, he has a habit of, like I said, over-promising and then under-delivering. And that might be something you can get away with a subject like Brexit, which we might go on and talk about in a bit. But when it comes to the pandemic, it's certainly not something you want to see played around like that. It's just, you want to know the facts, don't you? You want to know what's actually happening on the ground, and it's quite frustrating to be promised one thing and then for that never to happen. Do you remember the badges Matt Hancock promised for care workers?
There's so many things that like so many things have happened, and I've forgotten about them in this pandemic. Like, I couldn't have even told you that was a thing.
But like halfway through, Matt Hancock just blurted out that thanks for all the care workers' help, we're going to give them a special badge that just said care. And quite rightly, the response to that was, go away, Matt. We actually want a pay rise and PPE rather than a badge. But even that promise hasn't been fulfilled, and no care workers are going around with a badge they were promised 4 months ago. So, yeah, there's just a lot of odd decisions from this government, which makes you go, just stop promising what you can't do and just get your heads down and, just do what you're able to, please. Fingers crossed in this next stage as we move towards winter, they will get it together, because I think it will require a lot of, like I said, like the Prime Minister says, it will require a lot of us to follow the rules directly if we want to get this virus under control in the winter months.
So moving on to our main story tonight, Brexit. It's been a while. So I don't think anyone who's been paying attention to UK politics over the last few weeks will be at all surprised that we're looking into the possibility here, and I think the possibility is quite high, but we'll get onto that. The possibility here that a change to the withdrawal agreement proposed by our current government might break international law. I think first off, we should probably remind people about the withdrawal agreement. I know we've not really been focusing on it recently, and I suppose we need to delve into the actual bit of the legislation that is important in this case.
Yeah, so, first of all, Brexit, it's kind of, I used to hate talking about it. There was like a time where I was just fed up of Brexit and wish it would go away. And then for the past 2 weeks, I've been like, oh, Brexit, yay, I can, something that isn't COVID, I can watch this, and kind of, there's speeches in the House of Commons I can watch as I've stolen this term, I can't remember where for, but Brexflix, which is me watching BBC Parliament and watching the debates on the reading of this withdrawal, this change to the withdrawal agreement. It's been really enjoyable for me because you finally get that bit of parliamentary back and forth, good debates on both sides. You can see arguments being formulated, whereas you don't really get that in a pandemic over COVID because mostly the two sides are trying to work together towards a common goal. This one is far more robust, and you get to see the old arguments drawn up and see where the parties are now. But sorry, that's my own little tangent of how happy I am that Brexit is back in the news.
I mean, if you told me this time last year that we'd be happy for a Brexit headline, I would not have believed you. Yes.
Yeah. Crazy, crazy times.
It really is. So yeah, moving back to the withdrawal agreement. So this is the document that had to be pushed through Parliament several times, and in the end there was quite. I mean, the reason there was so much division over this, right, was because you had, Remainers who didn't want to have, like, initially it was like Remainers not thinking any of it was good enough because essentially we wanted it to be Brexit, soft Brexit. Oh, I'm remembering the egg analogies now. Wow, this is like a proper flashback to the past. So yeah, we had so you had Remainers arguing for a softer version of the withdrawal agreement where we'd essentially stay in the customs union for a long protracted time until we can get our stuff together, which seemed quite sensible, really. And then you had people on the other side saying, well, we want to just leave right now and cut all our bridges. And then, as tends to happen, a compromise happens somewhere in the middle. You can still complain whether it's one way, too far one way or too far the other. But this involved quite a bit of wheeler dealing with the EU, lots of like last minute talks, but it did kind of finally get sorted. And I mean, I remember we're talking back to before Boris, back in Theresa May, which seems eons ago, even though it was 14 months. Yep. So yeah, it's amazing that it was only that far, that long ago. I mean, a week is a long time in politics. So there was this backstop idea originally, right? That was in the event of a no deal.
Yeah. So the withdrawal agreement was meant to be our divorce papers, how the UK leaves the EU, and what happens if we can't reach a deal, were the main points that are sort of addressed in the withdrawal agreement. And most important of these points all seem to surround Northern Ireland and what you do with it. Because as much as the UK likes to think itself as an island that's separate from Europe, we have Northern Ireland, which shares a land border with Ireland, an EU country, and that causes a lot of issues for us when it comes to what we do with trade and the customs union. So originally, when we had Theresa May in charge, her withdrawal agreement basically said that it had a backstop in it. And the rule of that was, okay, we will negotiate with the EU about getting a deal. But if we don't get a deal, we agree that Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK will abide by the same customs union as Ireland. So we can have the free movement of goods across that border without the need for any hard border being set up between Northern Ireland and Ireland. Okay? That was taken back to Parliament, and of course there was a huge fuss around this, particularly amongst the Brexiteers in the Conservative wing of the party. We are talking Boris Johnson and Jacob Rees-Mogg and that contingency, because they essentially saw it as a way of Britain staying in the EU by the back door. In the event of a no-deal Brexit, we should be as free as possible. We shouldn't actually be more tethered to the EU by having to have their customs rules tied onto us. So we had that big kerfuffle, and essentially that's kind of what scuppered Theresa May and forced her out of the party and forced the Conservatives to elect Boris, who went for a very different approach. Now, the deal that Boris was able to get in November with the EU, that was our first one to stop a no-deal happening then, basically withdrew that agreement of the whole of the UK staying in the same customs union and instead kind of put a de facto border in the Irish Sea. So they called it a front stop, but what would happen was, in the event of a no-deal Brexit, the UK would abide by its own trading rules. So mainland UK, so we're talking England, Scotland and Wales, would abide by their own market rules. However, Northern Ireland would abide by the same customs union as Ireland. So you've still got, that way you're still avoiding a hard border between the two, but you've redrawn the border, so goods moving from Northern Ireland into the rest of the UK, there's a bit of a question mark of how that happens. Fingers crossed you try and keep regulations as, little changed as possible, and there's quite smooth movement, but you can't say what happens in a no-deal Brexit. So that is the deal that Boris Johnson got with the EU, essentially said was oven ready, and said that was what was going to get through Parliament. And of course, you could argue that his promise to get Brexit done is what delivered him a relatively large 80-seat majority in the Commons, and led to it being passed unanimously on all sides, I think, once it went through in January of this year. So now, take us to the present day, we're in the bizarre position where Boris Johnson is saying that this deal he agreed to is wrong in a sense, and that in fact what will happen in the event of a no-deal Brexit, if this internal market bill goes through, is that in a no-deal, Northern Ireland will abide by the same rules as the rest of the UK, and it doesn't have to be in a customs union with Ireland. Now, from everything I've explained to you so far, what's the big risk that kind of runs with relations between Northern Ireland and Ireland?
Well, yeah, so, the problem is, I think we discussed this quite a bit at length when it happened, but there's kind of three prongs to this problem, and you were never going to satisfy all three, because of the situation where Northern Ireland has a land border with an EU country, you are always going to have this problem where you end up with some kind of fudge that fixes 2 out of 3 problems. And the idea of there being a weird customs border between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK, while not perfect, I think the reason most people accepted that was the best backup option, bearing in mind the idea was that it would be a backup, not the intended plan. I think people would understand, there's already weirdness between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK for you see it all the time when you get a competition in a crisp packet or something, it'll say, available for everyone in the UK except Northern Ireland. There's so many exceptions going on already with Northern Ireland that doesn't seem too much of a stretch. But again, remember, the point of this was as a backstop, front stop, whatever you want to call it. The idea was that it was there if everything broke down. But the idea being that both the UK and the EU would negotiate in good faith and would get a deal, so it wouldn't be a problem. I think we will get on to the point maybe a bit later, but it does very much sound like the Conservatives are going for no deal and seeing what happens. Maybe it is a negotiation tactic, but getting what we're hearing from the EU doesn't sound like it's working as a negotiation tactic unless there's some kind of, Hail Mary deal at the very end, which has happened before. Like, I'm not ruling it out, but I definitely feel like instead of trying to go for a deal like Theresa May did, Boris's government are trying to go for no deal, which is not what I would want to do. Seems very antagonistic. But yes, the main problem we run into, as we said, was that therefore Northern Ireland has this border with Ireland where the EU rules would change. So we'd essentially have to have a hard border, because I don't know if you've been there recently, but you can just drive over. There's nothing stopping you. That's the point, of the EU. It's not like crossing over a ferry to the UK where, you still have to go through a port and stuff like that. You can just walk across the border. There's nothing there. There used to be a border a long time ago, but there is not a border now. So the problem with this change here is that in no deal, which is seeming increasingly likely, Northern Ireland would cease to be part of the EU customs union and therefore would have to have suddenly border patrol. So either we're just going to ignore the fact that stuff can cross the border willy-nilly, or we're going to have to enforce a hard border there.
Yeah. And I think the UK government's point would be that they wouldn't enforce the hard border. It would be up to the EU. And I might talk about this a bit later, but therefore they could point the EU, aren't the EU evil? They're the ones who forced us to set up a hard border between Northern Ireland and Ireland. But I think, in fairness, it must be a two-way street. I think both the UK and the EU have said that they don't want a hard border between the two, but I can't see the EU accepting having a neighbour, having somewhere that shares a land border where goods and services can just kind of freely pass and they don't know what's going on. In that sense, you can't just have this weird bit where they say, kind of forget about it, that's fine, it's tiny. It's like, no, we can't have this loophole left in our system. And I think even between, if you're looking at any country in Europe that isn't within the EU, that shares a land border with that country, they have come to some sort of agreement to make sure that they are on the same customs union terms. So I think if you have a look at Switzerland, even though they are very much not in the EU, I believe that the way their goods and services pass over that border, it's the same because they've realised that there is definitely a benefit to having the same trading rules when it comes to that point, and therefore they don't need to set up a hard border. Surprise, surprise. They can keep it soft. So this need to keep a soft border is super important, but by the Conservatives changing the terms of this withdrawal agreement, they're trying to get 3 into 2. We've talked about these 3 prongs, and you can pick 2, but you have to choose which 2 you want. The Conservatives, it appears to me, are trying to get all 3, and that's clearly causing problems for both the EU and those within Parliament who disagree with it.
So we've talked a bit about why this would be problematic for a variety of reasons within just the implications of how it would work. And obviously the EU didn't want this. That's why when they agreed the withdrawal agreement with us, they agreed what they agreed. So what happens if you pass a law in the House of Commons that changes a treaty that you have agreed internationally?
You break international law, and as the Northern Ireland Secretary Brandon Lewis said, you do it in a limited and specific way. Which I think has been the excuse for every driver who's being caught doing 35 and a 30 over the past 2 weeks. Sorry, officer, I was only breaking the law in a limited and specific way. Can I get off with it, please? First of all, there is no question this breaks international law and is kind of universally seen as bad form. You don't sign up to something and then go back on it. We'll get back into those details. We'll get back into that argument in more detail later because it's one of the primary arguments of the opposition. But this whole point of breaking international law was the thing that hit the headlines and has made this such a big talking point in Parliament. I probably wouldn't have the focus. If this was a minor Brexit bill that just fudged some things round the side in the event of a no deal but didn't actually interfere with any of the negotiations we're having, I don't think it will have reached this level of debate in Parliament, but the fact that it so brazenly goes against the withdrawal agreement that we agreed with the EU, that we would enact in good faith during these negotiations, makes it very odd indeed. And that phrase, breaking the international law in a limited and specific way, is certainly one that I think we're going to be hearing a lot over the next year. It'll be one of those things that you go, oh right, it was odd for a government to hear a government minister admit that that's what they were going to do.
I mean, there have definitely been a lot of strange moments and memorable quotes from all of this Brexit mess, but to see a minister stand up in front of the House of Commons and say that, like, you know, so matter-of-factly, it was not something I would have ever expected to see. There's a lot to talk about here, and I suppose we're going to go through it in various stages. The fact that when someone says something and all the lawyers are coming out and saying, yeah, that's bad, and then lots of senior civil servants and people like that who are lawyers are suddenly resigning, very much does not fill me with confidence. So if the Conservatives are going ahead with this, and I suppose DUP are lumped in with them because they have actually spoken out for it, but the Conservatives and the DUP are generally aligned anyway. What is their argument for the fact that we're proposing to break international law, which seems like a very, very bad thing to do? Like, they must have a really good argument, right?
Well, I will try and present it. Seriously, like, listening to the debates in Parliament without any commentary is the way that I've been able to digest this debate. And I know not everybody has the time and, you know, the willpower to sit through 3 hours of stuff. Believe me, I was doing other things while I was listening to them. But it does get you a really good idea of what the overall message that Conservatives have been told by their party to sort of say why this is acceptable is. And it's kind of, you get it through osmosis. They drill it in so often that maybe a little part of you goes, oh yeah, well maybe I can see why somebody would think that way. But anyway, so one of the big points, you know, why Conservatives are going ahead with this bill is, one, it's the EU's fault. Okay, surprise, surprise. It's not the government's fault or anything they've done. It's the EU. One of the main arguments is that they are not acting in good faith and that they are misinterpreting what the withdrawal agreement was all about. Boris Johnson said this deal was oven ready. He's claiming that the EU have simply misread their instructions and put it in the microwave for too long. So part of this I find very hard to believe, because what I described to you at the start, and I've gone back and sort of checked that this is what the withdrawal agreement said and how it was being marketed, was like, there are BBC explainer articles telling us that basically if there's no deal, there'll be a border down the Irish Sea. So to see people like Ian Duncan Smith and senior Conservatives kind of saying that this fact was sort of hidden away in details of the withdrawal agreement and nobody knew about it seems insane to me. Like,
I think I would call that disingenuous. I mean, I think it is definitely, like, it was discussed lengthily at the time, not just by us. You know, it's not like we're the only people who can read the withdrawal agreement. That implication was everywhere at the time, and people kind of went, okay, it's a decent compromise, and it should never happen because no one wants to go for no deal, right? How naive we were.
Yeah. So that's one of their big arguments, and those are the type of arguments that you listen to in the House of Commons and you think, this is a Brexiteer banging on about Brexiteer points. This will get them a claim in the Daily Express for bashing the EU, and will probably win them some votes amongst the general public that still thinks the EU is bad and will want to paint them as bad in any context. So even though that argument doesn't stand up to much scrutiny, I feel, when you actually look at it from a very factual point of view, it's hitting all the right emotional chords and will, you know, really help get some support from people in the Commons. The second way they've said it is that, sure, we're breaking international law, but it's in a limited way, and we're not the first people to break international law. So, again, this is a slightly odd argument, but they've brought up in the Commons examples of both France and Germany reneging on sections of treaties that they've signed up to in the EU because financially they didn't want to do it. Or even one example was brought up of the EU has ignored certain parts of the UN Charter of Human Rights because the EU court basically said that we have our own Charter of Human Rights, and that charter kind of supersedes what the UN has. And some people would argue that what the UN has is the highest form of international law. Why is the EU allowed to ignore that, but we're being dragged over the coals for breaking a part of international law? A part of that argument kind of feels... So to me, I can go, yes, there are other examples of other people breaking international law, but shouldn't we be bigger than that? You know, two wrongs don't make a right in that case. And none of these were... I would say none of those treaties surround something as important as Brexit. We knew that this Brexit treaty was going to be incredibly important for the future of the UK and of Europe. If you're taking one bit of international law to break, I would say that is actually fairly big when you compare it to those other treaties example. It's all relative, of course. But yeah, the main conservative argument there is that other people have broken international law, and we're not like Russia or China and all the evil things they're doing, so you can't really compare it to that. Ours is just a little technical point, and we're trying to be democratic about it, so you should give us some kudos for that. I'll quickly link it to my other point here, is that when they're talking about those places breaking international law, and when we're talked about the EU basically saying we can ignore the UN because it's our rules, that's kind of what the UK are saying here. They're saying that the UK should reserve the right to break international law when it is in our citizens' best interest. So they argue that the citizens of Northern Ireland will be at a detriment if they're unable to get goods and services from the UK in the event of a no-deal Brexit because of the withdrawal agreement. So the only way that they can stop the citizens of Northern Ireland having this big disadvantage and suffering in a certain way is to enact this bill. It may break international law, but actually it's for the greater good and will take that on the chin for helping to protect a section of our nation. So yeah, it is a bit of a question of sovereignty, and you can argue about the effects that, you know, how much effect it would have on the Northern Ireland economy, having a border down the Irish Sea. But that is certainly a part of the Conservatives' argument.
I think there is cause for concern if you care about Northern Ireland being part of the UK. I just had a look while you were talking there up of the polls. So if you look at it from the British side, 36% of the general population think that we should allow a poll for... Well, actually, if you look, so they have general population where it's 36% to 25%. They have Conservative voters, which is the most interesting one, at 32 to 30. Labour voters, it's overwhelming 48 to 21. And Lib Dems, it's 43 to 28%. And that is in favour of allowing a poll. And then most Brits still would prefer Northern Ireland to be part of the UK, and it's Conservatives who are the majority there. It's only Labour voters from 2019 who think the Northern Ireland should leave and join the Republic of Ireland. But so there's a majority of people wanting a poll, and then a majority of people being like, we'd like them to stay, though, which I feel is a bit like how people felt about Scottish independence. You know, we don't want them to go, but we feel they should have the choice. And then, but interestingly, lower down in that poll, and I'll post this in the show notes, 54% of Britons, mainland Britons, in March 2020 said that it wouldn't bother them either way if Northern Ireland left the UK. So I think there's definitely cause there for Northern Ireland to make an argument for unification. And also, I think the polls, I'm not sure if this is the closest they've ever been, but 45.4% of Northern Irish people back Irish unity, and 46.8% support union with the UK. So that is very close. You're moving into both, I think, kind of Scottish referendum territory and Brexit territory of close percentages there. So yeah, I can understand if you were a Conservative leader who didn't want that, you could be concerned that might happen currently.
Yeah, particularly, and when you consider the history of Northern Ireland as well, nobody's keen to, go back to those days. So what the Conservatives argue and members of the DUP argue, because I was quite surprised about when I heard of this bill, I thought, the DUP might be against this because it's something that affects Northern Ireland. But in fact, the DUP were one of the few parties that voted against the withdrawal agreement in its original form when it went through in January, but actually support this change because to them, it keeps them in closer ties to the UK. If they're in the same sort of economic alliance as the UK, then it brings them closer to the UK, and that strengthens the Union as well. And they feel that actually that will be a way of... The DUP sees that as a way to keep the peace in Northern Ireland by keeping them tied to the UK stronger. Now, other Conservatives that aren't in Northern Ireland have also said this. However, I think it is a bit naive to go down this line because, as we mentioned earlier in our argument, there is a chance that in going for this solution, you actually risk a hard border between Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland, and those who are not members of the DUP, but members of Sinn Féin, for example, will certainly be against that outcome. And you don't want to see a return to what happened in the 1980s, 1990s. So, yeah, those are the main reasons for the Conservatives and the DUP supporting the bill. I think there is, it's not entirely nonsensical. I don't think the government would have gone ahead with this plan if they couldn't defend it on some level. But to me, there are some arguments where there are clear weaknesses, and I believe they act more on passion and dislike of the EU more than actual kind of like the facts surrounding this withdrawal agreement as a whole.
So I suppose we should move on to arguments against it, and there are plenty. I think the first point, and we brought up PMQs and Ed Miliband previously, and we've got a link to throw in the show notes here, but you might have quoted Boris Johnson more times in the last few paragraphs than you have before by repeatedly saying oven ready. How competent is a government that claims something that clearly isn't oven ready is oven ready?
Yeah, it's a massive question mark, and one where you're like, it's not even the fact that it's an old bill put in by an old Prime Minister. So if this was Boris Johnson trying to overturn a decision from Theresa May, you could kind of understand it. But the fact that it's an agreement that everybody signed up to in January, and now they're trying to go back on it, it seems bizarre. And, that's what Ed Miliband basically, puts Boris Johnson on trial when he addressed him in the Commons at the first reading of this bill. There will be a link to it in the show notes. I think that's the full 18 minutes, but there are some absolutely brutal bits for the PM where he looks like he's just been hit for six a couple of times. And kind of, we've talked about it wistfully in this podcast before, but just a little glimpse into what the Millerverse could have been like, Where was that performance when he was leader of the opposition before? It might be argued that Cameron was far better in PMQs than Boris Johnson is, but still, I think it was quite a good performance from Miliband. But it questions the very competence of the government. Why are they going against what they enforced, in such a little time ago? If they're willing to flip-flop on this, what else are they willing to flip on? Is it just another government U-turn in a series of U-turns that we've seen over the summer? So it's less of an argument against the bill in itself and more an argument about the government that's trying to enforce it. But I think it does shake, confidence in how they're negotiating this withdrawal agreement with other people, if they can't even make up their minds about their own bill, their own affairs.
And I mean, so if we're struggling with the competence of the government as British citizens, we mentioned that it sounds like it's going to break international law. I know there were some claims, I don't know if you touched on, I don't think you did actually. There was a claim that the wording as it is does not break international law. It's only when we use those powers that we would break international law. But then I think there was definitely a lot of comeback from various QCs I saw on Twitter saying, no, it totally breaks international law. Like, it doesn't matter. Like, as soon as you put it in there, the damage is done. And so we've talked about this. So how do you refute the claim that you brought up from the Conservative argument that while it breaks international laws, so is Germany and France. Like, I know that someone else has already done it argument doesn't stand, but Germany and France are countries people trust to keep their deals. So what was different in those cases? Maybe if you can touch on that, and also if we do break international law using this method, what will other people think of this?
Yeah, I think that's the biggest implication is that not only does it break international law, it affects how we are viewed by the rest of the world, and is already doing so in quite a number of ways. One of the biggest critics of the government was the former Prime Minister, Theresa May, and it's worth pointing out that every single living Prime Minister from Major to May has dismissed the breaking of international law as something they wouldn't consider doing in their time in charge. Theresa May has... Her speech to the Commons yesterday was quite brutal and stinging, basically saying it doesn't matter who breaks international law, if it's ministers or if it's this parliament as a whole, if they vote on it, we're still doing it, and that reduces our effectiveness when we come to ask the international community for help in other situations. The big point she put forward was when there was the poisoning in Salisbury, the British government led an effort with the international community to throw out Russian diplomats, basically, as a response to that. And she argued that people listened to what the UK had to say was because of its standing, because it historically abides by the rule of law. They're one of the few countries that helped sort of like, not found the UN, but they are seen as one of the key members of the UN, of the Security Council, one that can be trusted. And by doing this, by breaking international law in this way and so blatantly in the face of such an important Brexit negotiation, you are damaging people's trust in this parliament, and that it doesn't matter if that's minor. I talked about the France and Germany examples. I think those were sort of like relatively internal disputes, particularly that breaking of international law. They were kind of breaking their own commitments to the EU, and nobody really kicks up a fuss, I guess, because France and Germany make up such a big part of the EU that they can kind of control a lot of the laws. I mean, we're getting onto a tangent of how the EU works and who the big players are in it, but I certainly don't think that those breakings of international law were as surprising or as, influential as this one is, when clearly the eyes of the world and the eyes of Europe are on how these negotiations go. For Britain just to kind of throw this spanner into the works willy-nilly kind of shows it appears to everybody that we're acting in bad faith. Even though the Conservatives say it's the EU's fault, I think it's fair to say that the rest of the world can see this as the UK trying to provoke a response from the EU by breaking international law and kind of saying, what are you going to do about it? Are you going to be the ones to put a hard border up between Ireland and Northern Ireland? It's provocative in a way that I think is like careless, and as Theresa May said herself, is both reckless and irresponsible when it comes to how you conduct a negotiation. Because in truth, if it's kind of common sense, isn't it? If I went into an agreement with you, Tom, on something, and I wrote it down on a contract, and then later I tried to back out of it and weasel my way out of it, or just not care about certain clauses, how would you feel about doing a deal with me in the future, or how would somebody else feel about doing a deal with me? Even if it's not the EU, you'd be worried that we might do the same.
Yeah, I mean, in that situation, I'd turn around and say to other people, oh, well, you don't want to make a deal with him because of X, Y, and Z. But except it's not even that people need to say that, because it's plastered all over the news. Anyone can see it. Yeah. So, given let's accept at face value for a moment the government's argument that the EU is acting in bad faith and we have to do this because of that. Surely there are other ways that don't involve us breaking international law. Isn't there? I'm pretty certain there's a clause in the withdrawal agreement about like international courts for arbitration if something goes wrong and everything, because there invariably is in any international treaty.
Yes, that's precisely what it has, and the government hasn't gone down these routes, which is again another frustration for the EU. I've heard Conservative backbenchers say the reason that they haven't gone down those routes is because A, we're only 3 months away from a no deal, and the arbitration would take too long. We need to sort of like make our own course. And 2, they'd say that the arbitrators in that dispute would be like the European Court, and we all know whose side they'd be on. I'm speaking from a Conservative point of view, not my own. I think that's like, it kind of shows that Britain has when we're negotiating this withdrawal agreement, we just have a disregard for the entire process if we're not willing to go through the proper channels and feel that we have to go our own way and break international law to get what we want. It seems a little disingenuous, again, and frustrating, and the fact that we're not willing to go through the proper channels, again, seems to place the blame for this crisis firmly at the UK's door from an outsider's perspective, not the EU's. So I think, again, this is another big argument against it. It's frustrating because why did we have to do it? Why are we kicking up this hornet's nest if we didn't have to? You may disagree, but there are, the EU may have not read the withdrawal agreement in the same way we expected them to, but if we want to be a good faith actor, I feel that we need to go through the proper channels first. Some people are saying that, oh no, we can still go through the proper channels. This is like a just in case those proper channels break down. But the fact that the government isn't willing to admit that it's even tried to go down those proper channels, again, makes me feel that it's in a bit of bad faith.
And I mean, I think if you had tried those things and people asked, oh, have you tried those things? You would say yes. Like, you wouldn't lie about that. There's no good reason to. So I think we've touched on this a bit by talking about Northern Ireland, but what happens to this with devolved institutions? Because we have, obviously, the Northern Irish government. We've mentioned the DUP. What happens there? And presumably both Scotland and Wales are looking over at this a bit unhappily as well.
Yeah, there have been big criticisms from like the SNP and Plaid Cymru about what this deal means for devolution as a whole. So one of the big questions we've got after Brexit is how the separate parts of the UK manage their economies. So, for example, let's say we leave the EU with no deal and we go into a trade deal with the US, for example. A lot has been made about chlorinated chicken, for example, and the fact that the US has much lower food standards than the EU and consequently the UK. If the UK was to enter a trade deal where we took chlorinated chicken into the country, Scotland would like to reserve the right to block sales of chlorinated chicken into the country. Okay? Because they would argue, we never voted for this. You know, we still want to be members of the EU. We want to still retain the same food standards. What this bill would do is create a separate internal market for all 4 countries that make up the United Kingdom. So the SNP are arguing that this bill actually takes powers away from Scotland and centralises them, and essentially chlorinated chicken would be forced upon them as a country. Now, we've never had this problem before because all 4 countries have had to abide by the EU food standards. So Scotland has never had to enact those powers, and Scotland would like to, you know, the SNP in particular, would like to think that it reserves the right to have those powers after Brexit. If it doesn't, then they see this as a massive power grab by the Conservatives. So I think that's why they're quite rightly miffed by this, and it does represent a certain threat to devolution. I can entirely see why the government wants to have its own internal market between the 4 countries. It certainly makes things easier. And again, if you're talking about different food standards between England and Scotland, what does the border become like there? What happens with goods and services that go across that border? You're bringing up a lot more questions that kind of roll into what would happen between Ireland and Northern Ireland as well. So I can see why the government wants to make it internal, but it's certainly pressing a lot of buttons for the SNP and Plaid Cymru in feeling that their nationalist agenda will be affected if this bill goes through. One point I didn't mention in my arguments against, but I just do want to point on, just as we've mentioned the US, is that we've talked a lot about how we feel that this might damage peace in Northern Ireland if there is a hard border put up between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. A lot of people feel that this would go against the Good Friday Agreement, or at least the spirit of it. And in particular, you've heard quotes from Nancy Pelosi and Joe Biden, who've essentially said, we would not enter into a trade deal with the UK if they did anything to jeopardise the Good Friday Agreement. When they went through in 1997, like, it had Bill Clinton there. The Americans were a big part of getting that deal through. And certainly in Democratic circles, they feel it's very important. They've got a lot of Irish voters as well who feel that's important. They want to maintain that agreement as well, the Good Friday Agreement. And it is likely that even if Joe Biden isn't president and Trump is, trade deals still need to pass through the House of Representatives. And I feel that it's very likely that the Democrats will still hold the power in that institution come 2021. So again, it's another argument between, you don't want to be held, the Conservative government would argue that you don't want to be held by what might happen, held to ransom by what might happen in places like the US. But unfortunately, it's a fact that you can't ignore what they're saying over there. So it's another, like, why would we go through with a bill that increases our chances of no deal, also might cause trouble in Northern Ireland, and the kicker to that would mean that we wouldn't get a trade deal with the US, who else would we trade with if we're not trading with our 27 closest neighbours and the US, who is meant to be a big trade partner, to come in and fill that gap? So, yeah, lots of arguments against it, and that's certainly another one that I've seen kicking around on the opposition benches.
So, given all this discussion, and we've talked about, multiple Conservative prime ministers coming out and speaking against this, including one who is still an MP, and obviously Labour are against it. But then the Conservatives do have an 80-seat majority. So how likely is it that the bill will pass through the Commons? For reference, I'm going to post a link that will be in the show notes, which is to the Parliament process. We're currently in the committee stage. So we've had the first reading. Maybe I'll just give a quick summary of this. You have the first reading, which is basically they declare that the bill exists with no extra information, really. Then you have the second reading, which is where everyone gets to kind of chat about it in the House of Commons, and then they have a vote to see if it goes to the committee stage. The committee stage is where it goes off into committees who look at amendments and things and changes to the bill and reword things. We then have the report stage, which is reporting on what the committee did. And then we have the third reading, which is the bill as it will go through if it is passed. If they vote it through at the third reading, it then gets past the House of Lords, where it goes through a similar procedure before finally there's a bit of, do we add some extra amendments that the Lords have suggested? There can be ping-pong back and forth at that point between the two houses, and then it goes on to royal assent and becomes law. So if we're in the committee stage now, I suppose my concern is, before the second reading, there was a lot of talk from various people about on the Conservative benches that they wouldn't vote for it, etc. But in the end, it still went through with quite a majority, despite the fact that it didn't sound like the government had presented any real answers to any of the questions raised, even by the Conservative MPs who were against it. So what do you think its chances are of passing? And also, how likely do you think these kind of problems with it are going to get written out in the committee stage?
One, I do think it is very likely that this will get through Parliament. The government has an 80-seat majority, and I don't think there is anywhere near the 40 MPs that are wavering. There have been no reports that there are up to those numbers that may rebel on this bill. There are certainly some high-profile people who are rebelling, amongst them former Prime Minister, like you said, Theresa May. But I don't think there will be enough to sort of mount a coup to stop this bill. The first reading went through without any real danger, but there was a lot of Conservative MPs who abstained, which shows that a few may be on the fence. I think the chances that it will be changed by the government, there are a few little tweaks that they are willing to make. In particular, Damien Green was part of a movement to make sure that international law would only be broken if Parliament got a chance to vote on it, rather than it just being a ministerial decision. So again, that puts the power back in the arms of Parliament. This was something we saw a lot in the Theresa May years, and when Boris Johnson took over and was trying to get his withdrawal agreement through Parliament, when the Conservatives had a very narrow majority and you saw a lot of rebellions. The Conservative Party were very reluctant to keep putting things or tie bills in that had to be approved by Parliament because they had such a slim margin. Now I think the government is absolutely fine to tack a clause onto a bill like this because they're like, hey, we've got 80 seats, go mad. We don't need to lose that many people, and with the support of the DUP, they're even more likely to have the numbers to push them over the mark to get them passed. So, yeah, I think it is, despite the fact we've had this back and forth and have been able to point out effectively how many weaknesses there are in this argument, it doesn't really matter when you look at the parliamentary maths of it. I think what will be more significant when we get to the final vote is which Conservatives don't support it, and what does that mean for their future careers. Like, Theresa May is probably in one of the most privileged positions that she is. A backbencher, a former PM. It's very unlikely. She's never going to get back to the front benches.
She can say what she likes.
Yeah, she's got complete freedom to say what she likes, and go ahead and do that and kind of keep her reputation intact. Meanwhile, other backbench MPs who've just come in the new 2019 intake, they might be less likely to rebel because they still want to have that, possibility of getting through government. We've talked a bit in the past on this parliament about how poor the Conservatives' backbench management has been and how that's led to a lot of U-turns, particularly when it comes to things like coronavirus and food school meals, stuff like that. But in this case, it feels like the government knows this is an important enough bill that it's got enough people on side, and it's willing to make the concessions where necessary to try and belay some of those people's fears about international law, or at least provide them the arguments to go back and tell their constituents about, yes, we're breaking international law, but it's not that bad. I feel the government feels it can get away with this, and backbench MPs are willing to go along with the ride with the Conservative government for this. So, yeah, and unfortunately, in my opinion, I don't see this bill having any trouble getting through the Commons.
If we're basically resigned to the fact that this is going to go through, maybe in a slightly altered state, but, essentially they can do what they want to it, how does that change things? I mean, we've already talked about lack of faith in the UK internationally because of breaking international law, but assuming we don't, enact this rule, presumably it's there as a sword of Damocles to hang over the negotiations.
Yeah, I think it's certainly upped the stakes in the negotiations. I might argue that I didn't think the stakes needed to be raised, really, but I think it is the UK trying to strong arm the EU into a certain position where it says, look, we can't be, you want us to have certain conditions over fisheries and other customs union policies. The UK wants a more Canada-style deal. Why aren't you willing to give us that? If you don't give us a Canada-style deal, we'll basically give us our own Canada-style deal, and to hell with you with the consequences. That's kind of the vibe I'm getting from the UK. Boris Johnson is certainly, more than at any stage, and he did this back in November, is kind of saying very publicly that, hey, we don't mind a no deal, we can shrug it off. Whereas I think privately, and amongst a lot of people within the UK, they know how damaging a no deal will actually be to the economy, particularly post-COVID. I think this is a lot of posturing, and fingers crossed. I remember talking to you back in November last year where I was like, if everything's to be believed, we're not going to get a deal out of this. I don't see how these two parties can reconcile. A deal came out of nowhere for that, and we ended up with the withdrawal agreement that both parties appear to be happy with. Now, a lot of Conservative MPs are still stressing that this bill is meant as a last resort, will only happen in the event of a no deal, and they want, I think something that's been said on all sides of the House during these debates is that they want those negotiations to continue, and the best result will be a deal with the EU. So that I think that reassures me. Part of me feels that we are more likely to get a last-minute deal, and that both sides will come to a compromise in the end. However, given what's just happened with the withdrawal agreement, if it will be the deal that the UK actually wants, and seeing how the UK might try and change or renege on those promises from if we end up with a deal, that'll be the interesting thing, because they pulled a deal out of nowhere in November, but then sorry, Boris Johnson had said, oh, no, parts of that were wrong, we'd like to change it. I don't think we can get away with this a second time if we come out with a deal by the end of December this year. Interesting times ahead. It always is with Brexit. It certainly looks like it's going down to a knife edge.
And I mean, I know there have been times before where we've been very worried right up until suddenly some negotiation is pulled out of somewhere. And the EU are quite good at saying, we're trying to negotiate and blah, blah, blah on the front of it, but holding fast until the end. So maybe there is a scope for some breakthrough at the very end. But I really don't like that our tactic has been to say we're going to shoot ourselves in our own foot, basically.
Yeah, I totally agree. It's in these times where you'd like a little bit of reassurance that something's going right, it's always a little bit worrying, isn't it, that we've got another phantom on the horizon, which is why it's super important that we bring up Brexit now, I guess, and why Brexit is coming back into the news again. It will unfortunately be with us for the next 3 months, probably run alongside other COVID stories.
So before moving on to our quick polls update, we'll just have a quick advert for another show on the network.
Join Mike and Tom for nerdy conversation with a multitude of guests on Hat of Many Things.
Say hi, guys.
Hi, guys.
Hello.
I'm Mark, a librarian and professional wrestling ring announcer.
I cast League of Legends.
Soteros Philbricato, best known for my work with White Wolf and Onyx Path Publishing on the World of Darkness.
Hi, I'm Jason Carl. I'm the producer of V5 at White Wolf.
Yeah, my name is Johanna Pettersson, a Finnish game designer.
So, Rob, do we want to go into a quick polls update over in the US and just, I know we did quite a big deep dive last time, but just quickly touch on the numbers. Well, we've got two pages. We still have our national averages for the US, Biden versus Trump. I think this has come down slightly from last time, so it's slightly narrowed, but it's still a solid 6.8% lead, with Biden on 50.3% and Trump on 43.5%. So it's definitely not the narrowest it's been, but there has been a tendency since kind of end of August to slowly narrow that. And I don't think that's surprising as we are in the run-up to polling day. And off the top of my head, I can't think of something stupid Trump's done this week. I'm sure someone in the US could find something, but as someone who's paying attention to international news, nothing has come across my radar this week, although it has been taken up with more Brexity stuff, as we've discussed. And then we have if you go to the other 538 page, the election forecast, Biden wins 77 in 100 times based on their predictions, and Trump wins only 22 in 100 times, with the others being no majority. So yeah, I mean, it seems like it's a very similar picture, but the gap is narrowing a bit. And obviously, knowing how things were with Hillary back in 2016 and seemingly having a good lead, the fact that it's starting to narrow a bit might be a bit of cause for concern, perhaps.
Yeah, certainly. I think there is one piece of news that may not have filtered through to the polls yet, and that's the death of RGB in the Supreme Court.
Oh yes, Ruth Bader Ginsburg.
Yes, and the reaction that Trump has taken. So Trump has been able to put in 2 Supreme Court justices whilst he's in power. The first that he put in was the one that I'm going to talk about now because it was the main bone of contention. Justice Scalia died during Obama's presidency, but Obama was effectively not quite a lame duck by then, but it happened into the last year of his presidency. And because the Senate controls who is nominated as a justice, the Republican-controlled Senate refused to nominate anybody until the election had been had, basically, on the chance they thought that Trump might get in. And Trump did get in, and they were able to approve a more conservative justice. Another justice has since retired then, which means it was up to 2. And with the tragic passing of RBG, that means that there is a chance for a 3rd conservative judge to go in. Now, it must be noted that her death is far closer to an election date than Justice Scalia's was, but instead the US Senate that is Republican-controlled still is trying to get a candidate in as quickly as possible so they can approve it before the election. It does seem, again, a little bit hypocritical of these Republicans who argued so strongly in 2016 that they were setting a precedent that, a president shouldn't nominate somebody in the last year of their presidential term. It should be up to the next one in line by trying to do this so quickly. And the fact that Trump is not holding back, he's taking the opportunity. It'll be interesting to see how the electorate reacts to that. I think evangelical Christians and Trump's base will respond very positively to that, but maybe the floating voter will be more dissuaded by that. We talked in previous podcasts about how the US is a system of checks and balances. So the House and the Senate are meant to be the check on the president, and the president can have certain powers over them. And the other, the third pillar of this system is the Supreme Court justices as they interpret the Constitution. By Trump nominating a 3rd conservative judge, he may essentially say that, right, we're going to have decades-long domination of a conservative reading of the US Constitution, and that might affect multiple people's rights, including minorities, members of the LGBT community, etc., etc. Maybe even affect abortion rights that have been there since Roe versus Wade. That may be overturned if you have a Supreme Court that is supremely conservative and is able to enact those policies for years on end. So I think that that's a massive issue for US politics, and the polls haven't quite reacted to that yet. I'd be really interested to see how they react in 2 weeks' time, when not only have they had time to digest that news, but at the end of the month, you've got the first Biden-Trump debate that happens. So I think it'll be all eyes on that, and seeing which candidate messes up the least, because I feel again this is a rather negative campaign, and they'll be looking to see who I don't think there'll be any sort of like big positive moments from either side, but we'll be certainly looking at how each candidate deals with not messing up, maybe not tripping over their words as much as the other guy.
Yeah. And I think I am right in thinking they've now announced the topics that are going to be in that first debate. You give me a hot second. Yes, so the first debate is going to be on the 29th of September, so we should be up well before then as an episode. And their moderator is called Chris Wallace, and the topics are going to be the Trump and Biden records, which I assume they mean their individual records, the Supreme Court, COVID-19, the economy, race and violence in our cities, and the integrity of the election. So, plenty of opportunity there to rehash some of the debates people have been having in the last few months, I think. It's going to be an interesting one to watch, I imagine.
Certainly. Box office, I think, you'll want to watch it. I think they're events, aren't they? They are massive events. Sometimes they turn out to be a bit of a damp squib, but there are moments in those debates, and you can look back over the years, and there's some argument to how much those debates actually affect the final outcome. But you certainly don't want to be on the wrong end of a soundbite in one of those debates, as they can really shape how the wider electorate views you.
Yeah. So thank you as always for joining me, Rob, and discussing the week or the fortnight's politics. As I always say, if you like the podcast, tell other people, share and subscribe, all of those things that help us get more downloads. We have actually seen a bit of a boost to our downloads, which is quite nice to see. I don't know if that's just because we had a US involved title last time. I do try and keep the titles a bit silly, but sometimes I just describe what's in the episode. We've also appeared on Amazon Music, as have all our other shows, because Amazon Music has now integrated podcasts, so that also might be part of the reason we're seeing a few more downloads. So glad for anyone who's joined us. If you still like what we're doing, you can, as I say, tell people about us. That's probably one of the best ways to help us out. But you can also go to patreon.com/TTSS, where you can throw a few dollars our way to pay for our hosting costs and things like that keep us running. We'd be forever in your debt. No, we would at least be mildly indebted towards you. And you can get special episodes like our pre-episode banter that we currently package and other things from other shows at the moment. And I think with that, there's nothing else for me to say other than it's good night from me.
And it's good night from him.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye. Bye. Bye.
Bye. Bye. Time to bake off.